Subcommittee will come to order this morning. The subcommittee will continue our series of open defense posture and budget hearings with our military services. Today we will hear from the Air Force leadership on their fiscal year 2019 budget requests. This is the second in our series of hearings with the military services on the fiscal year 2019 budget requests. We know that the Air Force has pressing needs for modernization across the board, and the National Defense Strategy demands an even greater pace of innovation. The subcommittee is prepared to help the Air Force meet that challenge. This is an open hearing, but if our witnesses would like to come back before the subcommittee in a different forum at some time to talk in more detail about the challenges the Air Force faces, please let us know. Before I introduce our witnesses, I would like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Visklosky, for any remarks he would like to make.
Chairwoman, thank you very much. I appreciate the panel being here today, your service. I look forward to your testimony, and Madam Chairwoman, thank you for bringing us together today.
Thank you very much. Allow me to introduce our witnesses, the Honorable Dr. Heather Wilson, Secretary of the Air Force, General David Goldfein, Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Secretary Wilson is making her first formal appearance before the subcommittee. Secretary Wilson, welcome. Secretary Wilson is appearing alongside the Chief of Staff, General Goldfein. General, thank you for your being here today. We look forward to hearing your views. Please proceed with your opening remarks.
Madam Chair, I'd like to enter my full statement into the record and just summarize a few comments. First of all, let me thank all of you for your work on the fiscal year 18 Defense Appropriations Bill. It makes a tremendous difference to the airmen whom we represent here today. And thank you to the members of the committee who've met with the Chief and I over the last 3 or 4 weeks to talk about individual concerns. We very much appreciate your openness to do so. The Air Force budget proposal for fiscal year 19 aligns with the National Defense Strategy. It recognizes that we face a more competitive and dangerous international security environment than we have faced in decades. We have returned to great power competition, and the central challenge to U.S. security and prosperity is one that we must meet. I would say that in this budget, there are really 2 bold moves. The first is accelerating defendable space. We need to deter, defend, and prevail against anyone who seeks to deny our ability to freely operate in space. And you will notice in the defense budget for fiscal year 19 over the 5-year defense plan, we have an 18% increase for space over the plan that we presented to you last year at this time. And last year's was an increase over the year before. The second bold move that's included in our proposed defense budget for the Air Force this year is the shift to multi-domain operations. We are proposing to change the way we do command, control, and communications on the battlefield, a mission that we perform for the Joint Force and particularly for the ground forces. So while there are 2 bold moves, accelerating defendable space and the shift to multi-domain operations, there is also one continuing effort, and that is to keep improving the readiness of the force to win any fight, any time. That's what you expect of your Air Force and of your Joint Force, and we're here to deliver. With that, I'd ask the Chief to join in here.
Thanks, Madam Secretary. Chairwoman Granger, Ranking Member of Visklosky, distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor for Dr. Wilson and I to represent 670,000 airmen as we update to you on the Air Force and our budget proposal for 2019. As Dr. Wilson stated, this hearing comes at a time of increasing global uncertainty. The security landscape we face has become more competitive, complex, and dangerous. In air, in space, in cyberspace, potential adversaries are rapidly leveling the playing field. As stated in the recently published National Defense Strategy, we face the reemergence of great power competition. And while we didn't seek this competition, let there be no doubt in this room and around the world, your airmen stand ready to defend the homeland, deter nuclear conflict through nuclear readiness, own the high ground in any military conflict with air and space superiority, and project global vigilance, reach, and power with our joint teammates, allies, and our partners. I saw it a few days ago in the faces of our defenders at Fort Bliss, training side by side with their joint teammates as they prepare to deploy to CENTCOM and AFRICOM. We saw it in January when Secretary Wilson and I walked with our airmen on the Korean Peninsula, assessing our readiness and support of the Department of State-led pressure campaign. In January of 2018, this year, airmen flew 253 sorties delivering lethal effects in the air-ground campaign that has delivered a punishing blow to ISIS in Iraq and Syria as we simultaneously apply pressure to the Taliban across Afghanistan. At the same time, our continuous bomber presence in Guam and the UK supported diplomacy in Korea and in NATO as airlift and tankers flew 1,400 sorties, taking off and landing every 3 minutes, delivering 12 million pounds of fuel and tens of thousands of tons of cargo and personnel when and where it's needed. We remain a global power because of global mobility. 89,000 total forced airmen are deployed or forward stationed around the globe, representing a fifth of our active duty force. And here in the homeland, airmen executed space, nuclear, cyber, remotely piloted ISR missions 24/7 to include flying the GPS constellation used by billions worldwide every moment of every day. Airmen participate in some way in every mission the Joint Force performs. We operate from below the surface in a remote missile silo to the outer reaches of space and everywhere in between. And we can do all of this only with the unwavering support of the American people and the leadership and support of Congress. This Air Force budget request allows our nation to confront today's threats and moves us toward the Air Force we need to face tomorrow's challenges. It builds on progress we'll make in 2018 to restore the readiness of the force, increase lethality, and cost-effectively modernize. But most important, as Dr. Wilson stated, we assured budget alignment with both the National Defense Strategy and the Nuclear Posture Review as both were being developed. And this budget supports the greatest treasure in our nation's arsenal, our airmen and their families. Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for your continued commitment to the force our nation needs and deserves. And on behalf of our airmen, we stand ready to take your questions.
Before we begin questions, you understand that we have the same limit on each member's questions and responses, time to 5 minutes. I'm going to start with questions regarding something that's just happened, so I'd like to start that, go to Mr. Visklosky, and then and Chairman Rogers and Chairman Calvert both have hearings they have to go to, so we'll have a different sort and go to y'all after that. Secretary Wilson, yesterday the President made a statement suggesting that the administration supports the idea of a Space Force. I want to know what your understanding of the current policy is and how do you interpret the President's remarks, and then both of you and Secretary Mattis have expressed concern about this in the past. Could you please reiterate your reasons for opposing this idea?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. As the President said yesterday, the new National Defense Strategy for Space recognizes that space is a warfighting domain. We appreciate the President and the Vice President's leadership on space. Nowhere is that leadership more clear than the President's budget, which the Chief and I are here to talk to you about today. This budget accelerates our efforts to deter, defend, and protect our ability to operate and win in space. There are a number of different elements of this with respect to the space portfolio, but it really starts to focus intensely on space situational awareness, the ability to command and control what is going on in space, and the ability to create effects in space in order to protect our assets on orbit. And it's a significant change in this President's budget.
Madam Chairwoman, I'll just say that I'm excited about the dialogue. In 2011 through 2013, I was deployed forward as the Air Component Commander in Central Command. And one of my—
Speak up a little bit louder, please.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. I was saying that from 2011 to 2013, I was deployed forward with then General Mattis as his Air Component Commander in Central Command. one of my responsibilities for him was to be his space coordinating authority and to take those capabilities that we bring from space and ensure that they were connected to his operational planning. As a Joint Chief, I see that same responsibility as the lead Joint Chief for space operations, is making sure that we have those capabilities that the joint team requires. And so, as the President stated openly, this is a war-fighting domain. That is where we've been focused, and so I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Anything to add? Thank you very much. Ms. McCollum. And Mr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary General, thank you for testifying here today. Thank you for stopping by in the office. So I'm going to just follow up on the record and ask you to continue to work with the committee on dealing with the hypoxia issue, especially the psychological effects on our pilots. And also, I asked the same question of the Navy, and I will with all the branches have people who are flying, what we're doing to coordinate together to solve this problem, because this is across the force problem, and I want to make sure that that there's coordination, because one, we'll get the answer faster, two, it'll save taxpayers money, and three, all the pilots in all our branches of the service will know that they're being equally looked out and after. And then we talked briefly about pilot shortages as well, and as I mentioned, we're experiencing that not only in the Department of Defense, but in other agencies as well. What we can do as a committee to either help you with addressing the pilot shortage, as well as what we as a committee, if you need additional resources to deal with a pilot hypoxia issue. And Madam Chair, I know sometimes we hear from the senior medical officers in a briefing, and if we do, I'd like to ask them this question. If we're not, if that's not on the briefing schedule, I'll be submitting some questions to them as well. The question for today, though, is on the nuclear weapons recapitalization, and I wanted to ask you about the budget implications of this nuclear posture review. The review states that the recapitalization and modernization of our nuclear forces could require resources of over 6% of the department's current budget going forward. The requirement of NPR could end up costing taxpayers well over $1 trillion over the next few decades. And in a time when we're struggling to meet domestic priorities of the people that we all represent in this room, and my constituents are telling me that their needs are not being met, I find the budgetary implications here to be quite alarming going out into the future. The department's also advocating for the modernization of our conventional forces. So I want to ask you both, given that the Air Force has responsibility for much of the department's nuclear command, how does the Air Force prioritize modernization and recapitalization of our nuclear forces against the needs to modernize our conventional forces? And why are systems like the long-range standoff missiles necessary to maintain a credible nuclear deterrent? How are you going to prioritize to meet all your needs? 6% of the department's current budget going forward is quite a bite out of the budget. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, and I'll take on the first two of those and then turn to the Chief for some additional elaboration. The nuclear posture review reaffirms the importance of the triad and nuclear command and control and communication, and says that it is our responsibility as the military to maintain a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent. For the United States Air Force, that's 2 out of the 3 legs of the triad. We are moving forward in this budget with the recapitalization or the replacement of the Minuteman III missile, which has not been updated since the 1980s, and it's just too expensive to continue to maintain. The one that you mentioned, the long-range standoff munition, replaces the air-launched cruise missile. I was out in Minot, North Dakota, with our maintainers there, and they were showing me why we need a replacement for the air-launched cruise missile for the airborne leg of the triad. The materials over time just wear out, and we need to replace the system. You also mentioned nuclear command, control, and communication, and the Air Force has a significant part of that as well. And this budget focuses on recapitalizing nuclear command, control, and communication. There's one piece that you didn't mention, and it's not really an Air Force mission directly, although we operate part of it, which is ballistic missile defense, which is also part of the nuclear deterrent. Nuclear weapons have helped to keep the peace since the end of the Second World War. And the nuclear deterrent is a core mission for the United States Air Force, and one that we have shouldered willingly. I would add your question about pilot shortages. This budget proposes to increase training to about 1,400 pilots a year for the Air Force, to try to increase the way in which we absorb pilots into squadrons, which is actually one of the limiting factors, and then tries to retain more pilots. And the Congress has authorized us to do some things with respect to finances. But the most important thing that we can do, and Congress can help in this, is that we are too small for all of the missions that the nation is asking of us. And I worry that we're burning out our people with deployment rates that are just too hard to sustain over time, and that in the middle of their careers, airmen are often trying to make that choice of whether they can continue at that high a pace for deployments. Maybe I ask the Chief to answer the OBOG's question and whatever else.
Yes, ma'am, and I would just offer on the nuclear, Secretary Mattis had stated, and I agree, that at 5 to 6% of the budget for the nuclear enterprise, the nation can afford to defend itself. And I absolutely am with the Secretary when it comes to the loss of life that we experienced before nuclear weapons were introduced, and then what's happened since then. When it comes to the kinds of weapons, the Nuclear Posture Review validated once again the requirement for 3 legs of the triad and to tie it together with the command and control, and then as the service that responsible for 2/3 of that, we make it an extremely high priority in our budget. When it comes to those specific parts of the nuclear enterprise, you mentioned the long-range standoff missile. This is all based on supporting General Hyten as the strategic command commander, the STRATCOM commander, and his plans that require us to be able to hold targets at risk. And all 3 legs of the triad and the munitions they carry all contribute to his operational plan. So that's what drives the actual requirement that was validated in the NPR. When it comes to the T6 and the oxygen generating system and the decision that the Secretary and I made to ground the fleet, we just had too many incidents that caused our concern. This is an aircraft that's been flying for years. We got over 2 million safe flying hours, but we had a series of incidents that happened in a short time frame that caused us to stop, ground the fleet, put a team of engineers and operators together to go in and look at the entire system, pull it apart. And what we found was that there were 3 parts of the system that were actually failing at a much higher rate than we had anticipated. And so we put our actions in place to go replace those parts. As those parts come in and we complete those actions, those airplanes are getting back in the air. We're on track right now to get to 275 this month, aircraft back in the air of the 444, and we'll have the remainder flying this summer. What I will tell you is we learned in the F-22 that as we worked through the engineering piece of this, we lost the communication with our families. And so one of the things that we're doing aggressively in this T6 is being really inclusive with pilots and their families to let them know every step of the way exactly what we're doing. And so as we get back in the air, I'm pretty proud of the team that's come together to make sure that we do this at a level that the Secretary and I are comfortable with.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Secretary and General, welcome to the subcommittee. We're especially delighted to see the Secretary back in her old haunts here on the Hill. We're proud of you, Madam Secretary, and we wish you and the General lots of good results. Let me talk to you briefly about pilot shortage, as been mentioned so far. At the end of fiscal 17, Air Force reported a shortage of 1,812 pilots. It's also been reported recently that the Marine Corps pilots are flying more hours than Air Force pilots. General Goldfein, perhaps you're best to answer this. What is the status of your pilot shortage now?
Yes, sir. And first, just to correct the record, we went back and took a look at the actual number of hours that our folks are flying. And in fact, we are pretty much parity with other services, and in fact, our joint teammates in many ways. The average pilot is flying in 2016 about 17.8 hours. We're on track now with investments we're making to get up to 20 hours per year, or 20 hours per month when it comes to the actual flying. So we are flying at the same rate as the Marine Corps, the Navy, all the services are flying the same. As we've dug into the details and analyzed the issue, it really comes down to two areas that we are investing in and focused on. One is how many pilots we produce, and then two, how many pilots we retain, because you have to get both of those right. And we've identified a target that we've laid the money in for to get us to 1,400 pilots per year that we produce. And we will achieve that in 2020. We're going to work our way into 1,200 pilots a year, 1,300 pilots a year, 1,400 pilots a year. We're going to be short of that this year, primarily because of the T6 grounding. And so we're going to be about 200 short of that. But we appreciate Congress's help in this, because the money that you laid in the budget is going to allow us to produce at the rate that allows us to sustain the force that we need. On the retention side of the House, we really appreciate what Congress has done to authorize us to increase the pilot bonus. But we're also finding that it's a combination of quality of service and quality of life initiatives that we're working on to increase retention of the force. We have over 66 initiatives that we're working simultaneously now that's looking at, how do we produce more control over time? The Secretary talked about operational tempo. We're looking at assignment processes, how we can give people more time at one assignment. We're looking at talent management that we're doing. So we have a number of actions that we're taking that's looking at both production and retention going forward. And right now, we believe we're on track to be able to get to a sustainable force model in 2020. Final point. While we are 2,000 pilots short right now, I think it's very important to know that we are not short in the operational field. We're manning the operational field and cockpits to 98% to 100%. Where we're actually managing the risk is on the staffs, where we have positions where we require pilots. So the staffs are short, but cockpits forward are full up.
I understand that you've been seeking retired pilots to return to active duty, and that applications are being submitted. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, it is.
And how's that working?
So right now, we're the authorization we have is for 1,000, and we're just in the early months of that, putting forward. We've had on average 15 or so folks that are coming back, and we're actually reaching out. I'll tell you that my father, who's an 85-year-old retired fighter pilot that lives in a retirement community, is really excited about coming back. And I've had to tell him that, hey,
Old
Dad.
soldiers never die.
That's right. That's right. He has a T-shirt that says, the longer I lived, the better I flew.
What is the reason that they're leaving the Air Force? Is it money?
Sir, I think there's a variety of things. First, the airlines are hiring. The airlines will be, with its mandatory retirement from the airlines at age 65, and they are hiring 4,500 pilots a year is what the projection is, and that's not going to slow down. So there is an opportunity to be able to make a fair amount of money as a pilot in the private sector. The second thing is the recent change to the law in recent years that said you can't sign on with a regional airline until you have 1,500 flying hours. So the path to be able to get to be a commercial pilot is very limited. You can fly in the Air Force for 3 or 4 years and still, you're finally at full-time flying, maybe get to 1,500 hours. But from the inside, for someone who comes in and serves for 10 years as a pilot, it's really not just about the money. People don't come to be an Air Force pilot for the money. They come to serve. But there's also that point it gets to where you think, something? Over the last 3 years, I've been deployed for 18 months, and even when I'm home, I had 3 weeks of TDY or temporary duty to red flag, and then I was up at Alaska, and then I'm 12 hours a day in the squadron when I'm training here, and I missed the last 3 birthdays of my kids. Can I continue to do this? Can my family continue to do this? And so it gets to that point in life where some people are finding it difficult to keep that balance. And that's what we hear the most.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I want to talk about the Additive Manufacturing Institute in Youngstown and just share with you and the committee some of the things that have been going on. And the America Makes is the name of the institute in Youngstown, Ohio. This was one of President Obama's initiative where he wanted to start 30 or 40 of these institutes to bring public-private sector investment into newer technologies that could help in the area of defense in particular to bring down the costs, improve lead times. So we have the 910th Airlift Wing Reserve Unit that does the aerial spray in Youngstown. They are obviously a part of this, and through America Makes and through some of the research, this team has significantly reduced fabrication lead times and proved to be a huge benefit to the Air Force. In the case of the 910th Airlift Wing, the lead time for parts was reduced from 10 weeks to 4 weeks, and the cost per part was reduced by 30%. They are now moving on to F-18s and F-15s. They have 3 areas that they're working on: bell cranks, aircraft oil coolers, and fairings. Now, I'm learning about this as we go. But for the example for the bell cranks, 30% reduction in lead time they're thinking they're going to get, and 20% cost reduction. For the aircraft oil coolers, 30% reduction in lead time and improved productivity are expected. And for the fairings, which help smooth flight surfaces with good aerodynamics, they think they're going to reduce production time by up to 50% with a 30% cost savings. So this is the exact kind of thing I would hope we all could agree to keep investing in, because it's reducing costs, improving lead times for these spare parts where we don't need necessarily a million of them. You may just need a few of them. So I want to thank you for supporting this and just ask you a question. The other point I'd like to make is when you see who's doing the research, so for example with the bell cranks, it's Youngstown State University, Pennsylvania State University, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Youngstown Business Incubator, M7 Technologies. It's truly public-private partnerships in local communities. It also has a local economic benefit for us as well. So the question is, how is the Air Force developing this expertise to apply additive manufacturing and these other emerging advanced technologies for continued effective maintenance and sustainment of the legacy aircraft, and what steps are being taken with future or current or future contracts to allow Air Force access to the electronic design files that we would need? Now, Madam Secretary, we talked about that. So if you could just address those 2 questions.
Congressman, first of all, the Air Force is very interested in additive manufacturing and 3D printing of parts for a couple of reasons. One is the logistics problem is much less if you can just take the raw material and build the part where you are rather than trying to have to go back to a supplier. Second is so many of the suppliers are no longer in business. I mean, you think about it, the A-10, the prime contractor doesn't even exist anymore, and we often have difficulty finding parts. You highlight the issue, and it may be an area where we need help from Congress, and that has to do with intellectual property. If we need a new handle or a fairing on an aircraft and the supplier is no longer in business and we can't get somebody to make the part for us, we don't always have the intellectual property to be able to do it. Now, we might be able to scan an old part and be able to use that, but the manufacturer may say, you know, we no longer make those, but we still hold the IP. This will be an increasingly contentious issue on contract negotiations going forward, but we also have huge numbers of legacy aircraft. If we want to drive down the cost of the Air Force and what we spend in terms of equipment, we really have to focus on sustainment. And it's going to be an area of increased emphasis. We had a meeting about it yesterday with our new Assistant Secretary for Acquisition, and we're looking at really moving forward in this area in a very rapid way.
Great. I'm just so everybody is aware, so that it's like a 3D printer that you've heard of, and the desktop style can sit on your desk and print the back of your case. They just get the material and it pumps into what looks like a printer. It is a printer, and it just prints. But they also have industrial size ones that can print parts for aerospace and all kinds of cool things. But this is a game changer for us. And when I was in Kuwait last year, they had 3D printers, and it was the same thing right in the middle of the base where they're printing this stuff out for smaller things. But we've got to solve this intellectual property issue so that we can access this stuff and be able to print these parts and save the government and the taxpayer a lot of money and get good quality parts for our planes and other aircraft and stuff. So thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Secretary Wilson, General Goldfein, thank you for being here, and thank you for your service to our country. As the committee knows, I have a particular interest in space, both in terms of access and maintaining superiority. I was pleased the Air Force has finally moved toward competition in space, and we see the costs are coming down. A few questions on launching capability. I have three, and then if you please could answer them. Can you give us an update on the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle program, the Air Force pursuit of 2 launch systems that will provide assured access to space while incorporating competition to keep costs down? 2, while we build that capability, our adversaries in space are aggressively pursuing technologies to erode our superiority in space, as was mentioned. What steps are you taking to enable the Air Force to move more quickly with innovators in the private sector to win this contest? And finally, considering the Air Force's past resistance to change in the status quo, I can always think of the UAVs and the Air Force's slow movement into that technology. How are you pushing your workforce to aggressively pursue disruptive technologies and incorporate a new way of thinking?
Mm-hmm. Congressman, a couple of things. One of the things you may have noted in the press from our space acquisition arm, which is in Los Angeles, we led a $100 million contract for innovation in space. It's a consortium. We did it with other transaction authorities to be able to work with companies who wouldn't normally work with the Air Force because we're often bureaucratic to work with. We're also moving forward with actually a significant realignment and reorganization of Space and Missile Systems Command out of Los Angeles to be able to move faster, in order to innovate, to prototype and do a variety of things. I think this budget, particularly on space, there are so many different things that are over the 5-year period on space in this budget, but let me highlight a couple of them. Space situational awareness. We are accelerating our ground-based optical sensor system, our deep space advanced radar system, and our next generation space surveillance satellite. With respect to missile warning, we chose to cancel space-based infrared 7 and 8, which were large and largely undefendable, and to accelerate to next generation missile warning with smaller sensors on a large bus so that they can have extra fuel and what we might generally call chaff and flares to be able to defend missile warning on orbit. We have a number of areas what we would call space control, and be happy to come back. And I know the chairwoman has talked about showing you one of our space exercises in classified session so that you can see what we are seeing, what we project, and then what we've done about it in our budget to be able to defend in space. Chief, you want to talk about the ELV and some other things?
Yes, ma'am. So, sir, you know, the direction we were given by Congress was really to accomplish 3 things during a transition period to do the following. First, to ensure that we had assured access to all the orbitology for any platform that we had to put up into low or high or geosynchronous orbit. And while we did this transition, that we would come out the back end with 2 domestic competitors that would be able to provide launch services. And on the third was, as quickly as possible, get off of the Russian RD-180 engine. That was the direction we were given. And right now we are on track with all 3 of those to be able to complete the transition period, come out the back end with 2 domestic launch service providers. We have 4 other transaction agreements right now working with 4 companies who are looking at propulsion systems. Because as you know, when we started down this path, we were not actually looking to build a new engine. We were looking to contract a launch service. And I will just share that, in the most recent launch of the SpaceX Delta Heavy, we were side by side with SpaceX with a whole team of airmen during that launch, and that's just an example of how we've done this, public-private work together to ensure that we come out the back end and achieve what Congress told us to do.
Thank you. I would just point out that nowadays, it seems the private sector is almost in every instance is moving faster than government in innovation and new technologies. And I think today we just have to keep up with what they're doing and try to incorporate that into new weapon systems as we move forward, and do a better job of accepting those technologies and dealing with it. So, thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sutherland Springs, as you know, is in my district, and I know that y'all have been working on improving the reporting. Can you tell us where we are on that particular situation and what you understand the department is doing across the board also besides the Air Force?
Congressman, we stood up 2 task forces to scrub all of Air Force records back to 2002, 2 task forces of 30 airmen. They have been full-time on scrubbing those records since the incident in Texas. It's actually taking longer than we expected it to do. We have over 100,000 records that we have already reviewed back to 2002. As we identify those that should have been reported, we are working with the FBI to report them. At the same time, we're working with the other services so that we're sharing our lessons learned with the other services. And we are trying to fix processes and training going forward. So we're, and in addition to each of our MAGCOMs, and took note of the training sticking, and if not, what's our next step to do additional training? We don't have a reporting problem. I will say that it's taking us longer. Initially, we thought we could get through all the records by May. It's actually taking us longer to get through all of those records looking backwards. So it's probably going to take us another 4 or 5 months to get through everything and try to close out every case.
Okay. Appreciate it, y'all. Patrol, we're short, and Secret Service, I mean, everybody's having a hard time because we know the demographics. A certain population is getting older and retiring, but what specifically, I know we're all been talking on, but I want to know specifically what are you asking that will be different from what other predecessors have done?
Sir, there's a couple of things. One is we're increasing the number of people who are going through initial pilot training, so bring in more people. We actually don't have a shortage of people who want to come into the service to be Air Force pilots. We then have to absorb them and train them up in the squadrons. That's actually one of the limiting factors. We're particularly short of fighter pilots. We only have 56 fighter squadrons. You can imagine that if a fighter squadron has half of its people who are brand new pilots, it's hard to season them, it's hard to train them and absorb them. So that's a limiting factor. And then it's retention. And retention really is an everyday thing. It's not just at the 10-year point when they're wondering whether they're going to stay or leave. And the chief talked about some of our initiatives. There really are over 60 of them. Everything from, do we allow more flexibility and more control of schedules and lives so that you can choose to stay at your same base or you'll take a remote and come back. We've reduced the number of pilot requirements that are forward, scrubbed every requirement that said we need a rated officer on a staff at Central Command, for example. Do we really need a rated officer for that? We've taken some of our 365-day tours and said, can they be 180-day tours? So there's a variety of things that we've done. And then, of course, there are pilot bonuses that try to narrow some of the gap between what the airlines can offer and what a pilot makes for pay. But we also have to recognize it's not about the pay. It's about the quality of service, the quality of life.
Right. Sir, if I could.
And well, go ahead, and then I want to give my extra time to Mario. No, I'm just kidding. Yes.
Sir, just to add to the Secretary's point, part of what Congress can do as well is the recognition that this is a national level challenge. The problem that we're finding ourselves in is that we as a nation don't produce the number of pilots to adequately service at the same time commercial, business, and military aviation. And so in each of your states, there are colleges and universities that are actually in the business of producing pilots. Any incentives that this committee or members of Congress can put in place that could increase the numbers, that is going to help the overall challenge we have.
Well, if you can give us some ideas, because I know my time's over, but even in Homeland, even in Homeland, Air Marine is short, Chairman Carter. So, I mean, we're just short on pilots. So if you have any specific ideas to work on this pipeline, because it's the recruitment and the retention, but any specific ideas, let us know. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chairman, thank you very much. And Henry, thanks for remembering that. General, thanks for a lifetime of service to our country. And those of us who've had the privilege of working with and knowing Secretary Wilson know that there is nobody who is tougher, who is more thoughtful, who is more honorable, who is more straight than this secretary. So I think all of us were very pleased that the president made a great choice.
I bought your coffee this morning.
I want to go a little bit about, talk a little bit about the light attack aircraft. And so in the final report on the experimental phase, my understanding is last month that it went really smoothly and that things went well. But I understand that the light attack procurement is not funded in FY19. And so even though the experiment is set to take place in 18, so I think it would be helpful, and I think the committee would like to have an idea as to, you know, schedules and funding plan for this new mission and how it will potentially drive down flying hours and cost, and potentially even pilot retention. So can you talk a little about the next phase of the experiment and what that will look like?
Yes, sir, I can. First of all, kudos to the chief. Before I arrived, he signed out a memo that said, we want to do an experiment. Signed it out on the 5th of March. It was 1 page long. We added 4 pages of explanation. So that was the length of this request for proposal, 5 pages. And said, we want to look at light attack aircraft. That was in March. By August of last year, so 5 months? 5 months. We had 4 aircraft on the ramp at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico to test. This is the way the Air Force should be doing things. And we were able to do that because you gave us the authority to experiment. Just try it. We don't have a program of record. We got the first report. We're now taking 2 aircraft, the AT-6 and the A-29, and we're going to do some additional experimentation this year. We put a wedge in our budget of $2.4 billion for the United States to buy light attack aircraft and create some squadrons. I have to tell you, depending on how this experiment goes, we may want to work with you on moving that money around in the 5-year defense plan, but we put a wedge in there to do that. If we decide to move forward, I think we should move forward quickly, and we'll work together with Congress to get the necessary authorizations and the plan that makes sense to do the acquisition. We believe that this needs to be coalition at the core. By that I mean we are already reaching out to allies and partners who may want to purchase their own light attack aircraft and be interoperable with the United States of America. This is all part of a strategy to deal with the prospect of continued violent extremism at lower levels of U.S. effort with cost-effective aircraft, but also doing it with allies and partners. So it is aligned with the National Defense Strategy, and it's one other way in which our fiscal year 19 budget and plan is well aligned with the National Defense Strategy. Now I have to say, I got the short straw. The chief got to fly one of them when we were out in New Mexico. So you want to add anything, sir?
Ma'am, I think you hit it exactly right. The big idea here, because we often will get a question, is this replacing this? Is this replacing that? This is directly tied to building competitive space in a new era of pure competition to allow us to build the partners and the allies and partners in their capacity to be able to drive this violence down to a point where it could be managed in individual countries. And so when you think light attack, the the Secretary said it exactly right. Think allies and partners, because that's the big idea.
Actually, I see my time is winding up, so maybe in a second round. I yield back, Madam Chairman. Thank you.
First, Secretary Wilson, welcome back. We worked together on Intel with a lot of these issues, and I'll take a dinner instead of coffee.
Deal.
In fiscal year 2019 budget submission, funding about JSTARS, that you're going to eliminate that program. I understand at least part of the plan that the Air Force is discussing.
Yes, sir. Thanks for the question. You know, I think it's important to set the foundation first on the platform we're talking about, the Joint STARS aircraft. It was actually a test aircraft that was brought into being during Desert Shield to give us sense of what the ground maneuver was as Saddam Hussein was maneuvering his forces. And at the time, Captain Dave Goldfein was deployed to the Middle East for Desert Shield and then Desert Storm. And recently, and Dr. Wilson at the time was recently graduated Rhodes Scholar who was working on President Bush's national security team. When we brought that weapon system on in 1990 to perform in 1991, you know, if you just think about it, we were still years away from even cell phone technology, let alone what we know today in terms of the internet and everything else we have. It's performed brilliantly over the years. And I will tell you, in 2011 to 13, I employed Joint STARS in the surge in Afghanistan and in the withdrawal in Iraq. And once again, we needed to know what was going on the ground and how do we manage the battle. The challenge is if we had taken that same scenario and put it into a European scenario, any soldier, sailor, airman, and Marines who were actually on the ground wanting to know enemy activity in a contested environment would have been blind to enemy movement. Because we were part of the build of the National Defense Strategy, Secretary Wilson and I had the ability to continue to look at our budget throughout the building of that strategy to see where we were aligned and where we were possibly not aligned. As the strategy came together on focusing on peer competition, it became very clear to us that the recapitalization plan and the investment that we were making in a platform-to-platform solution would not survive in a contested environment. So we're choosing a different pathway. One of the most important things that allowed us to change this is our ability to fly the current Joint STARS for longer than we thought we could, because we did a deep dive. That gives us the time to actually look at an alternative approach to the future. Specific to your question, how do we leverage the investment that we've already made? We're going to use that investment and look at that technology growth across the system of sensors that we now have available to us that are coming from all domains, and looking how we fuse that so we won't lose that investment.
Real quick,
Congressman, with respect to the threat that we face, I think, without going into too much detail, I think it's everything from jamming from the surface or a cyber attack to direct ascent satellite weapons, either from Russia, and as you well know, when we were on the committee together, in 2007, the Chinese tested an anti-satellite weapon and spread debris all over orbit. So I think the challenges and risks are those. I think this budget that we have proposed in front of you today does a whole variety of things, but one of them is moving faster towards jam-proof GPS. So we're moving to the next generation of GPS. And you think about GPS, the Air Force operates 30 satellites in orbit just for GPS. We have about 76 satellites total, about 30 of them are GPS. And since 1992, the Air Force has been supplying GPS, paid for by the taxpayers, but to the users for free. So if you got here to this hearing today by Uber, or if you looked on Yelp last night for the restaurant nearby you, or if you just take out your phone and look at that blue dot, or if you got money from an ATM machine, all of those services are provided by a squadron of less than 40 airmen in Colorado Springs, Colorado. We provide GPS to the world, to about 1 billion people every day. It's a pretty amazing capability, and we're going to keep it resilient for the long term.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and let me echo everybody's pleasure, Madam Secretary, at seeing you in your spot. I mean, none of us on either side of the aisle could have been more pleased, and certainly all of us that had the privilege of serving with you are delighted with the President's choice. I want to focus a little bit on an area that we don't spend enough time on, although my friend Mr. Ryan actually touched on some of this a minute ago. We spend a lot of time talking about procurement, not a lot of time talking about sustainment. And the cost balance there is pretty great. So I'd like to pick your brain a little bit and see what you're thinking about how we'll keep the frankly excellent sustainment system we have, and some things we can do to improve on it. I mean, you look at that workforce, it's an old workforce. A lot of them are like my dad, did 20 years in the Air Force and then 20 years at Tinker Air Force Base. So you always have a lot of pretty senior people that are within a few years of retirement. And every time we get a hiring freeze, I know what that does at Tinker Air Force Base to General Levy and just trying to maintain the workforce that he does to turn around these aircraft. So please give us some of your thoughts on what we can do to keep sustainment costs low and keep that workforce, which does such great things for us, intact.
Thank you, Congressman. One of the things to start out with is this budget funds sustainment to 90%, and that means about $15.1 billion in this fiscal year alone. You are also correct that one of the things that helps most with our civilian workforce is certainty on the budget. When the Air Force went through sequester several years ago, we lost 30,000 people in the wake of sequester and the reduction of the size of the force. But we also had a lot of civilians who were told not to come to work next week. And that furlough of civilians had a terrible effect on morale and the feeling of being part of the team. And I think you probably saw that pretty clearly at Tinker. I do think that there is a huge amount of cost in sustainment, and we probably haven't looked enough, and Congressman Ryan mentioned it, as a priority on how do we drive down the cost of sustainment by taking advantage of new technologies and particularly advanced manufacturing. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity there, and it's going to be a real priority for us going forward.
Well, I do too, and I agree very much with what my friend from Ohio had to say on that point. I would also ask you to pick up on the point he also made about the intellectual property as we're negotiating to procure, because getting the right to that is such a critical factor in keeping down the cost. And we're retaining airplanes that, as you pointed out in your own testimony, look, we don't even have the original contractors anymore. I mean, we're still running K-135, 400 of them plus through Tinker. We're happy to do the work, but it's not predictable work anymore, and they literally have to, it's almost like artisan work. They have to literally strip it down and see, because they don't have any studies that tell you how long the metal is going to last and everything. So if we don't own the ability, the right, if you will, when we procure that, to reproduce that product at a reasonable cost, it's just going to drive the cost through the roof. So I would ask you, as you negotiate for new weapon system, that we keep that in mind, that
you're negotiating for the intellectual property as well. You can put that in our hands, since we're paying a lot of money for it, so that we can sustain those airplanes.
Sir, can I just add too that I give Secretary Wilson a lot of credit for, especially coming out of being the president of a major STEM university, to look at our labs and our science and technology and our research. And one of the things that you're going to see in our budget is a significant increase in what we're doing in the business of science and technology. How do we get things faster from the lab bench to the flight line?
The other thing I'd ask you to look at, and actually Tinker is an excellent example, again, they've built partnerships with our career tech institutions and with our higher ed institutions to try and let them know years ahead of time, okay, these are the kind of skills we need, these are the sorts of people that we want. So that there's tremendous opportunity there, and frankly, increasing competition. When I was 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have anywhere near the number of contractors in the immediate vicinity of Tinker Air Force Base that we have today. And they're in competition with that base, obviously appropriately, for very skilled people. I mean, I think Tinker alone can hire almost every software engineer the University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State produce right now, and they're competing with really good competitors at Boeing and at Northrop Grumman and what have you. So that thinking ahead, we're thinking a lot about pilots. We need to think a lot about engineers and a lot about maintainers as well.
Congressman, let me just add a couple of things. With respect to maintainers, we're actually doing much better with our, we were really short of them 3 years ago, and now we're not quite so short of them, although they're now apprentices, and we got to get them to be craftsmen and to be masters. With respect to engineers, hiring engineers and scientists and cooperation with universities, one of the things we also lost in the wake of sequester was the summer intern program, which is really the only way you're going to get an engineer or scientist right out of school. Is through internships, because they're in such demand. This summer, for the first time in many years, the Air Force has restarted its internship program. We now have 431 summer interns so far that have signed up to be with the Air Force, 3/4 of them engineers and scientists. We are also working, and it's more of a localized issue, on how do we get the tradesmen, who are the craftsmen, who are machinists and tool people, and we're working that issue as well, trying to partner with more local higher ed institutions.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Adderholt.
Madam Chairman.
Mr. Adderholt. That's right.
Thank you, Secretary Wilson, for being here. Good to have you back here on the House side, as it's already been mentioned, and thanks for your recent visit to the office. We enjoyed our visit. General, good to have you here as well. We've been very interested in laser work in the U.S. military, and just wanted to ask your opinion about whether you think that the budget meets that challenge that we have with the work that we're looking at.
Let me make sure I heard the word right. Directed energy, lasers?
Lasers, yeah.
Yes, sir. First of all, we are doing, there is money in the budget for lasers, and particularly several different tests that we're doing with lasers and directed energy generally, and I'll ask maybe the chief to elaborate a little bit. But we are also doing we launched a year-long review of the science and technology strategy for the Air Force to identify areas of high priority for the Air Force to do research in, and also look at the way in which we conduct our research, because a lot of it had moved to be internal and not in partnership with industry or higher education. I would also say that that the 3 service secretaries, we get together every other week for breakfast now,
which you mentioned was a new thing that
it is.
Yeah,
it is. It's terrifying the staff,
yeah.
and. But one of the first issues we focused on was our research and development portfolios. What are the other services doing? What are we doing? One of the areas that we identified where we want to look at what each other are doing and how we can leverage each other's success or fill in gaps was directed energy.
General, if you
And sir, I'll just add that in parallel to the service secretaries meeting, we're at this point in our history where every one of the Joint Chiefs, we fought together, and we all grew up under this guy named General Mattis. So the camaraderie and the dialogues that are happening at both the service secretary level and at the Joint Chief level, and I give General Dunford a lot of credit for how he's pulled this team together. we are looking at our levels of investment in places like directed energy, hypersonics, quantum computing, all those game changers, and looking for ways to ensure that we can put the most resources against the problem, so we can swarm against the problem with the resources available and get the best possible end state coming out of that. I think Dr. Griffin, met with him this week. This was a part of our discussion. He grew up in the labs. He understands how they work. I think he's going to be very helpful in this dialogue. So I think the conversations we're having are very helpful.
Okay. Let me jump off to my next question, since time is limited. And a little bit, we talked a little bit about the ELV launch service agreements. And thank you for giving us an update about the status of that. Just the bottom line is just, is there sufficient funding to keep up with the schedule that you're on now?
Yes, sir, we think there is.
You think? And I guess one of the, another question I have, if one of the providers decides for some reason that it decides to get out of the launch business after fulfilling a contract, what rights are secured for the government to continue using that launch vehicle?
There's actually written into the contract that there's a fee associated with not competing for launch. So we've thought through that in terms of how we constructed the contract. And we've written into the contracts as well ownership of data rights to ensure that we have more control over the actual data and the IP, the intellectual property as we go forward. So we did think through that.
So if I could just add one thing, you know, back in the 1990s and 2000s, we were thinking, what the heck are we going to do? We've got to keep we've got to keep national access to space, and the launch industry had collapsed. And how are we going to recover? I have to give credit to predecessors and their ability to work with industry to develop and support a competitive launch industry. And it's now not just dependent on the U.S. government. And the cost of launch is plummeting. You have multiple choices. And the size of payloads is also going down. So we're getting to a point where the cost of launch is enabling business plans to close in space that never were possible before. The result is we're getting more and more launches because and that keeps the price going down. This next year, last year I think we had 29 space launches that we did out of the Cape. It's a Air Force operated facility. We are driving to 48 launches a year. It is, and the Air Force is changing the way in which we partner with industry to enable American leadership in space launch. And it's really kind of an exciting time.
Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you both for being here. Secretary Wilson, really pleased to see you. You were a source of information for me when we were members of Congress together. I learned a lot from you, and I want to thank you for that. Back when I was young and stupid, still may be. Okay, I got Fort Hood in my district. I'm about ground forces. And two sergeant majors who served in my office have told me that the most welcoming sight any soldier in a really bad fight is an A-10 on the horizon. That close air support it puts a smile on every soldier's face and every Marine's face. That being said, let's look at the future of close air support. What does it look like in this more contested environment we're in? We're now in a global war on terror, and in addition, we're pivoting over to a great power competition. What is the future of aircraft used for close ground support? You talk about the efficiencies of how we match our close air support capabilities to the enemy we face, both now and the one we're thinking about.
So let me start out, and then I'll let the chief fill in. But with respect to the A-10, the fiscal year 18 budget, which I think you all are trying to wrap up, would restart the line for redoing the wings of the A-10 and would buy probably the first 4 sets of wings for re-winging in addition to the 174 or so that are already done. And then the fiscal year 19 budget has $80 million in it for more wings. Now, will that get you somewhere between 8 and 12? Probably. So the A-10 is expected to stay in the inventory through 2030. In addition to that, and it's really, this is one of the things that's really changed since I was a young officer in the Air Force in the 1980s, is that we can do close air support off of a variety of platforms. So it could be off of an unmanned platform. It could be off of we're doing close air support off of aircraft that were never intended to be anything other than strategic aircraft. But I would absolutely agree to you. The sound of those whining engines on the A-10 is welcome to those on the ground, and it's one of the things we take seriously. The last time an American soldier or Marine was killed on the ground by enemy aircraft, the last time, was April 15th, 1953. It was a long time ago, and so as the chief likes to say, whenever an American soldier or Marine hears jet noise, we want them to not even look up because they know it's us.
Sir, it'd be helpful if those sergeant majors know that this chief's been fighting side by side with the Army my entire career, and this is nothing short of a moral obligation. Let me just give you a vignette to put in perspective perhaps what the Secretary talked about in terms of how we mass different kinds of capabilities to ensure that we have the right attributes over the battle space to be able to support the ground force commander. So as the Air Component Commander during the surge in Afghanistan, we divided Afghanistan into regional commands. And in each of the commands there was a different terrain, and there was a different scheme of maneuver that required a different attributes that then I would place overhead to support the ground force commander. In RC South, Regional Command South, it was really flat terrain, and so I needed something that had persistence over the battle space. And so, I would really heavily push MQ-9 Reapers over the top of that battle space. In RC East in the north, very heavily mountainous terrain, optimized for being able to get into those valleys, and so an A-10 was absolutely spectacular. At an RC West, because of the distances that were involved and because of the range of weapons I needed, a B-1 was perfect for RC West. And then I would have F-15Es that I would place in RC South. If I'd gone to those ground force commanders and said, hey, listen, I'm going to pull the A-10s out of here and place them over here, they would tell me the attributes are misaligned. So part of what an airman does is we understand the ground force scheme of maneuver and what we're trying to accomplish, and then we place the right asset or family of systems overhead to be able to provide the fires, because when you're on the ground and you require the air components, every second counts. And I want to make sure that when that call comes, that we're there, and if they hear jet noise, they know it's the sound of freedom coming to help them.
And thank you very much for that description about how you map out what you have to do. That's very helpful. And I hope we can keep that date you've given us into the great and future battles, all the battles we have. You do a wonderful job of air support for our ground forces, and they really do appreciate it. They're very proud of the fact that the Air Force is up there for them, believe me, and they tell me that all the time. So thank you for what you do on behalf of Fort Hood.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and Secretary Wilson, General Goldfein. Thank you so much for your leadership, for being here with us today. Let me start by just saying that the men and women of the 187th in Montgomery, Alabama could not be more thrilled for the extraordinary opportunity that you have given them to host the F-35 mission in a few short years from now. But thank you for recognizing their professionalism and their capability. And the River region in the state of Alabama is very, very excited about this opportunity. So thank you for that. Let me also say, Secretary Wilson, thank you so much for the time that you spent in my office yesterday. We covered a lot of ground, and I appreciate your taking the time to speak to George, my son. So thank you for that. You were big hits on Instagram yesterday. You were a big hit on Instagram yesterday. Look, I just want to bring a few things up, and then I'll let both of you respond. I mean, of course, our state and particularly Alabama's 2nd District shares a very close relationship with the United States Air Force. We have a large footprint, as you know, and Things that are important to me that I'd like for you to touch on as far as the budget is concerned. A couple of things. Rotary Wing training, of course, at Rucker. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. Just want to let you know that it's on our radar and we're watching it, and we would love to have any additional information. I know you're in the initial stages of taking a look at that, but just want to stay informed about any decisions or information that pertains to that moving forward. Professional military education, we talk about a lot of shiny objects in this room, and PME often gets left out of the discussion. I'm going to take this opportunity every time to bring it up. It's very important to what our military looks like in the many years to come. And so I don't ever want it to get glossed over that professional military education is such an important component of what we do. And so many of you in this room have come through Maxwell and Air University and the War College and all of the other educational components that exist there. I do want to touch on one thing in light of a question about STEM education. The STAR-based program at Maxwell is so great. It is a coordination with the public school system in the River Region to bring elementary school age children to Maxwell for a course to expose them at an early age. This is something that the Department of Defense is doing across all. Fort Rucker has a similar program in the summertime for underserved communities. So I want to just bring that up because I know it's something that's dear to you and we appreciate the partnership at home. So professional military education, the Rotary Wing component at Fort Rucker, and then also the information technology at the Gunner Annex. We've talked about in this room as well the fact that IT and cyber moves at such a fast pace. Sometimes the appropriations process doesn't keep up with the changes in technology, and so I would love for you to talk about those things for the committee. But again, let me just say this and then I'll be quiet. Thank you to you and your families for your service and sacrifice. It certainly means a lot, your dedication to our country and to the Air Force. We really just appreciate it. So thank y'all both for being here today.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'll start out on a couple of things. First, with respect to professional military education, of course, and everything that we do in Montgomery and beyond, one of our obligations and major goals is to develop exceptional leaders to lead the world's most powerful teams. And a lot of that is done through professional military education, and we are deeply committed to it. With respect to Fort Rucker and training, we have sent out a request for information. It has to do with how do we train helicopter pilots, and it gets back to the pilot shortage. All right, if we're going to train 1,400 fixed-wing pilots, do we somehow separate out how we start out helicopter pilots so they don't start out in the same flow? So that can we use that to expand the pipeline even further? So we're just at the information gathering stage with respect to that. I'll let the chief expand on some of the others, but I will just say that while we make decisions based on the criteria that we set, and we're trying to be very open with everyone and just, no thumb on the scales, just make the best decision we can for the Air Force and for the mission. It was a great pleasure to make sure that the 187th, the famed red tails of the Tuskegee Airmen, will have some F-35s to put some red tails on. Thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks again for being here with us today, for your clear and direct responses to a lot of questions, I know. I appreciate you touching on the JSTARS recap program. We've had robust discussions about that here many, many times, and so I have one quick just sort of follow-up on that, and it's really on behalf of one of my colleagues, Austin Scott, who's just been a phenomenal champion for Robins Air Force Base in Warner Robins, Georgia, which JSTARS are hosted now. And but there's been some, I don't know, discussions we understand within the Pentagon that there's still openness, or combatant commanders still want this type of platform manned. Can you confirm whether or not there is still open discussions about this, or is it truly closed out and moving on to the additional options that you spoke of earlier?
Do you want to talk?
Sir, I'll just tell you that that as we go down this path, the opening conversations I had was, first of all, with my fellow Joint Chiefs, specifically Chief Staff of the Army, Mark Milley, and Commandant of the Marine Corps, Bob Neller, to make sure that they understand, because they're going to have to explain it to their force, right, that this is not in any way, shape, or form by the United States backing an inch off of supporting them. The challenge we have with the current recap is that if their Marines and soldiers and our airmen, who are often embedded with them, are in any kind of a contested environment, they will be blind to enemy activity with what the previous plan was, and we can't go there. So the dialogues we're having, and I had conversations this week with General Scaparrotti, General Botel, General Waldhauser. I'm having with each of the combatant commanders. And everyone I talk to, as I explain it and lay out for them, they see the value of the new approach we're taking, because it's going to help them in all of the potential conflicts and the operational plans they're responsible for.
So I'd just add to that, what a combatant commander wants is eyes on. They don't care where it comes from. Sure. So it doesn't really, I think it's not about the platform that it's on or where it comes from. In fact, you know, when you're listening to the radio, the chief and I were forward in Central Command Area Authority. We were in Iraq on the morning that the Tal Afar battle kicked off, and we were in the Tactical Operations Center. People talking on the radios, you have no idea whether whoever's talking to you on the radio is in an AWACS or a JSTARS or on the ground. You have no clue. So what they need is the information and the sight picture about what's going on the ground so that they can win. They don't really care what platform it came off of.
Right, and I don't disagree. You're absolutely right. One quick additional question, and maybe you could, before you answer the additional question, just describe the difference between contested and non-contested, and will the new platform you're discussing or options take care of the non-contested arenas as well. The subcommittee has been very supportive of Compass Call, the cross-deck program, and yet the current plan that you've proposed in 19 shows a replacement rate of 1 airframe per year. Can you help us understand that, would there be additional savings to this subcommittee and your efforts if we did 2 airframes per year, and if you could just give a little description of, should we be doing more, or is 1 sufficient?
Sir, if I could take that one for the record, I'll go back and look at what the schedule is and so forth.
Okay.
Unless Chief, you know and can bail me out?
No, I will, because the 1 per year is actually not tracking, so I just want to make sure we have, if we can take that one for the record to make sure that we have exactly what the schedule is, we'll come back to you. Very quickly, contested versus uncontested.
Right.
Uncontested would be very much like the Middle East, where I can actually place any aircraft I have in the inventory anywhere I want and fly it for as long as I want, because there's nothing that can actually take it out or threaten it. That's the uncontested environment that we've enjoyed for the most part in the Middle East now. A contested environment would be a scenario that the National Defense Strategy tells us to focus on, which would be a China or a Russia, where they have a fairly significant threat array. They've watched over the years how we fight. They know what our asymmetric advantages are, and they've invested in capabilities to take those away from us. So a contested environment would be those where the threat is significant. We tend to call it anti-access area denial, is the terminology we tend to use within the Defense Department, but it's their ability to hold us off at ranges where we can either no longer perform our mission or it's more challenging. One thing I will tell you is that no country on the planet can actually put a block over its country and deny us access. The very best they can do is put Swiss cheese over the top, and because there are holes there, and my job is to find out how to exploit them and hold targets at risk for the Commander-in-Chief.
And so your plan would be to use this new platform in contested and non-contested areas?
Actually,
that was sort of my...
No, sir, thanks for the question, because actually we're not looking at a platform. We're looking from a platform solution, which is where we were,
Right.
to an integrated set of platforms and capabilities that we can now fuse together. So I can provide the capability for, General Votel in an uncontested environment, what he needs, while at the same time on day one I can give General Scaparrotti and his folks what he needs, because I've got to do both. I don't have the luxury of doing one or the other.
Great, thank you.
If I could just elaborate on that a little, because it is, we often think about platforms, and what we're talking about here is that almost everything that's flying today and everything in space is a sensor. So you've got space sensors, you've got manned and unmanned platforms, you've got things on the ground, things at sea, radars and different, the F-35 has a radar on it. We've got unmanned platforms with radars on them or cameras on them in the same in space. The trick is to fuse all of that data to give you a much more comprehensive picture on what's going on the ground.
Frelinghuysen and Mr. Visklosky to the last. They asked for that, the gentlemen that they are, so I'll now call on Chairman Frelinghuysen.
Great. Welcome back, Madam Secretary General. I note that you were a year apart at the Air Force Academy. I'm not sure whether you knew each other back then, but we're very proud of both of your accomplishment. I asked the question of Secretary Spencer of the Navy last week. I think it maybe ruffled a few feathers. You're going to have a windfall of money here. At some point in time in the near future, we're going to get our 2018 bill passed, and then we're going to move fairly rapidly into 2019. What are you going to do with all this money? In one case, in a relatively short period of time, and then looking towards 2019. So I sort of asked sort of a rhetorical question, or perhaps not so rhetorical. What are your priorities? We have space dominance as an issue. We have remaking the Air Force, and what has been touched on very lightly, the huge sustainment costs of the F-35. I'm a supporter of it, but you know, the tail of that plane, and then I read in Defense News all the complicated platforms you're putting in there, and all of which tie in through very sophisticated means. You've had some problems with some of the less sophisticated means, which is ALICE and ALS. What are your priorities, specifically as they relate to sustaining this, really, the plane that's going to be is jointly you know, run and of such value to us and to our allies?
Thank you, sir. The overall priority in this budget is really to align with the National Defense Strategy. We accelerate the move to defendable space. We also shift to multi-domain operations, and we really focus on continuing the emphasis on readiness. We are in this budget proposing to purchase the next 48 F-35 aircraft, so we're continuing with the purchase of the new aircraft. Of course, the F-35 is now operational. We have 272 of them in the Air Force today, over 100,000 flying hours on the F-35, and it's performing well. You point out one of the issues, which is the cost of sustainment of the aircraft. And the Air Force is, of course, this is a joint aircraft, so the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, Mrs. Lord, and the Joint Program Office are the ones that are primarily doing the negotiations and focusing on this. But the Air Force, as the biggest customer, has a strong interest in continuing to drive down the cost of sustainment. That means negotiating very hard with the suppliers to reduce costs, but also to bring in competition for those parts. Is there the
possibility that the cost of sustaining this remarkable aircraft could compete with your other needs here? I mean, this is a big, and then you're adding, as we should hope you would, additional assets to these aircraft here, and I worry just in the sense of the vulnerabilities of, let's say, some of the planes we have now. If we can't even get the system of systems working now, and we add more, you know, is there a distinct possibility that those who we view as our adversaries could find some vulnerabilities?
Sure, I'll just tell you, I give Secretary Mattis a lot of credit for the team he's pulled together. And so whether you want to
speak up a little bit,
yes, sir.
General, thank you.
I give Secretary Mattis a lot of credit for the team he's pulled together. Secretary Lord, who comes from industry, has taken on sustainment and has put together teams who are actually wire brushing and driving down the cost of sustainment across all of our weapons system beyond the United States Air Force. He's brought in a deputy secretary who also comes from industry, who understands how to produce large weapon systems and how to sustain it. So the team he's brought into place that's helping us as joint chiefs to be able to drive down the costs of sustainment is rather significant. And as an international air chief, I look at this through the lens of not only what we do inside the Air Force, but how our allies and partners that are a significant part of this strategy can leverage what we do to drive down sustainment costs, because if we're paying more, they're paying more.
Just the last comment. I know the Air Force is in very competent hands. I just saying you're going to get a flush of money here. You get a flush of money, representing, what, $716 billion in the Defense Department is wide. And, after that, anything goes. I mean, it could be a relatively dry hole. And I'm just hoping, and I'm sure that you're assuring us that whatever the money that's coming down the pipeline, that it's going to be well spent, because in the future we may not have that we may not have a CAPS deal that has embraced, I think rightly, our future defense needs.
Sir, I understand you completely. And our job is to get $1.10 of value out of every dollar that we spend in the Air Force, because somebody earned that dollar. So it's cost-effective modernization. It's driving down the cost of operations. It's making sure that every person that we put towards a job is a job best put in that place and not in some other place. And so I agree with you completely.
Thank you. Mr. Visklosky.
Thank you very much. I have 3 questions. The first question, and recognizing this is an open hearing and just want to broach the issue, is on the new nuclear policy. There's a discussion about a variable yield warhead for the crews. And very concerned, not being a military or foreign policy expert, about the uncertainty issues such as hypersonic weapons, varying yields create relative to our adversaries, recognizing they're working along the same lines. But that, as the Secretary pointed out, we've not had a troop killed from aircraft since 1953. We've not had someone die in a nuclear incident since 1945. Don't want that to happen. What are the opportunities and challenges because of those variable warheads? And again, I have 2 more questions. Just if you just touch on the subject, we can follow up later.
So this, the variable yield is something more for the Navy than for the Air Force. Historically, we have had variable yields on different nuclear weapons for different kinds of targets. But the specific item I think you're referring to, it probably is maybe better addressed by the Navy.
Maybe. Second question, following up on Chairman Rogers' question about the pilot shortage, and Mr. Cole talked about the civilian retention. Secretary, you've talked about the quality of life, quality of service, pay, and I absolutely agree with you. Another question, are you finding a problem retaining people after they get their security clearance? Because, as you point out, the taxpayers are paying for GPS because the government can't do anything right. And the government pays for those security clearances, and then someone comes in and they're gone. And I also wonder about morale, that I'm an eager young person, bright, can't wait to work for the federal government. And my fellow employee says, just wait till you get your clearance, because you're going to double your money and you're going to leave federal service.
Sir, actually, we don't find a problem retaining people who have clearances. We have in some areas, I mean, pilots is the biggest issue, or aircrew generally is the biggest issue. We do have some difficulty because cyber professionals are also in very high demand. I would say that our biggest challenge with security clearances is getting them through the process in the first place. Our backlog for security clearances over the last 18 months has almost doubled to 79,000 backlog waiting to get their security clearances. 79,000 people in the Air Force waiting to get their security clearances.
What do you attribute that to, if I could ask? Because that is horrific.
Sir, we don't do the security clearance background checks. ourselves. There's a process through the Office of Personnel Management, and it's gone from, the backlog has gone up from 48,000 to 79,000 for the Air Force. We are partnering with them and putting hubs for the interviews. We've asked them to change their processes to be able to do interviews over Skype rather than person to person, but it's a major issue for all of the services.
Last question, follow up on Chairman Frelinghuysen, passing up on 18 and 19. Congress, in its infinite wisdom, has not dealt with the Budget Control Act for the last 2 years, 20 and 21. What problems does that present you as far as looking ahead? Because I know you're working on 20 and the out years now.
Sir, budget certainty is one of the most important things that the Congress can do for us. And nothing did more damage to the American Air Force in the last decade than sequester. Sequester did much more damage to the Air Force than anything our adversaries have done.
Okay.
Sir, can I just offer that in many areas, we still have not recovered from the last time we went through the sequester because we made some decisions that were not irreversible. And so as we go through and look at this, when you've got to find upwards of $10 billion in a single year, then you make some rather significant decisions and trades that are then irreversible. So the last time we went through this, we grounded 2/3 of the Air Force that stopped flying because if you weren't getting ready to go to the Middle East or you weren't coming back from the Middle East, you stopped flying. And so you don't recover that readiness. It's not linear because not only the air crew lose their readiness, but the air traffic controllers, the munitions builders, all those folks that are not participating in a flying operation. And all I'll just tell you is that morale and readiness of the force are inextricably linked. If you walk the line today at Bagram or Kunsan in Korea, what you'll find is morale is very high because they are manned at 100%, they have the parts on the shelves, they've got the supervision they need, and they've got a mission and they're focused. The bill payer to get to them to that level of readiness are the sourcing wings from back home in the CONUS. And when you walk those lines and you see less than full number of parts, less than a number of people, less than the right amount of supervision, you'll find that morale is much lower. And if we're going to keep this force, our investment that you're seeing in our budget in improving readiness is perhaps going to be most of the important work that we do to keep the force in.
One of my great regrets in my wanting today is not going to change a thing is that 3 separate elected Congresses have set aside 6 of the 8 years of the Budget Control Act, but we haven't dealt with the last 2, and I've hit my head with a hammer 3 times. I'm going to do it again. And in the meantime, there's lasting damage. Thank you, Madam Chair.
That concludes today's hearing. I'd like to remind the subcommittee members that our next hearing is tomorrow at 10 a.m. I will be on time. The subcommittee is adjourned.